For our episode on media and politics, we talked to Ayi Makaraig, journalist and junior lecturer from the University of Amsterdam. Here is our full interview.
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me, and hello, Aaron, and hello to the viewers. Is it viewers or listeners of your
Listeners, yeah.
podcast? Listeners of your podcast. So, just briefly to introduce myself as you did. So, I'm Ai Makaraig. So, I am a journalist from the Philippines. I've worked as a reporter in the Philippines for more than 11 years. So first for ANC, ABS-CBN News Channel, Rappler, and the French news agency Agence France Presse. Okay, so going to your question, what is the role of the media in politics and specifically in the Philippines? So for me and for many journalists that I talk to, for my colleagues, the role of the media in politics and democracy really is what we call the fourth estate. So that means the media is the watchdog of people in power. So to translate that, it basically means we hold power accountable. So that's why journalists report about corruption, human rights abuses, any issue that is of public interest. So we want to make sure that people we elect, as you talked about the elections, and it's a very timely topic, that, for instance, they live up to their promises, they live up to standards of honesty, integrity. They don't steal our taxpayers' money. They follow the law. They pay taxes. That's the role of the journalist, to call out this wrongdoing through reporting, especially investigative reporting is important in this watchdog role. And as you specify the context of the Philippines, that's very important for our country because, as we know, institutions are weak, they are not that well developed. So the media serves another role of this check and balance function of being in a democracy where branches of government check each other. So the media as the watchdog also serves as another check of power.
Right. No, so as the fourth estate, it's a very important institution in our democracy. No, so uh, however, in the last decade, diba, we've seen several changes in the way people communicate in a very general sense, diba? Especially with the coming and the continuous development, for example, of social media, diba? So, and with this, we see the proliferation of several mechanisms by which users can generate content and can share content, 'di ba? No, so kaya nga nagkaroon nung parang in a way, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, parang pagda-dichotomize dun sa quote-unquote traditional media and yung social media, 'di ba? No, so in your opinion and in your experience and in your studies, how has this changed the landscape of journalism?
Social media.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely the rise of social media has totally changed the landscape. It is a major change, if not one of the most important changes in the last decade or recent decades, because before the advent of social media, there was that thinking that journalism, so as you call it, traditional media now as we know it, so that's your, say, mainstream TV channels, TV Patrol. Remember the golden age of TV Patrol, Hoy Gising, very, I mean, these are brands or shows familiar to us. For example, during that time, traditional journalism we're regarded as the gatekeepers of news. decide what people get to read as news or get to watch as news, what are the most important issues of the day. And as we know, of course, now with social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, that has changed because the power has shifted increasingly to the users, social media users. And I would also have to point out the platforms. So Facebook, they are now actually regarded as the new gatekeepers because it's through these platforms, social media platforms now, that we consume news. When something breaks, for instance, when initially last year, right, when Bongo decided to run for president, I mean, things like that, these news stories now break on Twitter or on social media. It's not anymore that we will hear about it on TV Patrol first or read about it the next day from the Philippine Daily Inquirer. That has changed. So it has totally changed the landscape in terms of the influence and power. And also another problem, as you point out, the spread of disinformation or fake news, because nowadays, many people tend to believe immediately what they see on social media as the truth, as the source of truth, and that becomes contested, whereas before, we would just say, listen to Ted Filon or Lauren Legarda, even before that, and like traditional journalists, and we would believe that as, say, the truth or reality, but that's not the case. Chat apps, for instance, our Viber groups where your titos and titas are believing all these for wrong information or commonly regarded as fake news. So that has totally changed. So in terms of the influence of the media to decide what is news, that has changed. And also the spread of disinformation and misinformation, what we regard as fake news. So those are the two big consequences of the rise of social media.
All right. No, so in that particular, yung some scholars would call post-truth era nga, 'di ba? When truth can be bent to your to your liking. Of course, it has magnified tenfold with the rise of populist leaders, 'di ba? All over the world. No, so we have Trump, Bolsonaro, and then of course in the Philippines we have in the last 6 years Rodrigo Duterte, who has consistently, in a way, discredited traditional media as biased, at nakita natin yon na nagti-trickle down dun sa mga supporters niya, na talagang continuous yung proliferation ng discourse na biased kasi yan, kaya ganyan, so don't believe that, mga ganyan, no? So can you share your thoughts on this, na parang in the last 6 years, no, what has been the struggle like for journalism in the Philippines?
Okay, maybe I preface this as the first half of the Duterte presidency, the first 3 years, I was working as a journalist. So I was experiencing this personally as a journalist. The second half of the Duterte presidency is when I did my master's. So that's where my academic hat, where I put on my academic hat, because my thesis was precisely about this topic of the attacks on the media under the Duterte presidency. So the question of populism, basically. So yeah, so in my study and in my experience, populist leaders like our President Rodrigo Duterte tend to use this label of fake news against traditional journalism or mainstream journalists in particular, like other populist leaders around the world, to discredit them, to undermine the media. And we have seen that. There's a specific instance, for instance, where he called Pia Ranada of Rappler fake news in a press conference. And of course, you have also seen him outrightly saying he would not renew the franchise of ABS-CBN. And, we have all seen his speeches insulting the owners of the Inquirer, ABS-CBN, and also journalists at Rappler. So it has happened. in the past 6 years, and it's also not isolated to the Philippines, as you mentioned, some examples of other leaders. So it is used as a tool. So that's basically the tactic, the strategy of many populist leaders. One, to rally their base, because they thrive on the grievances of people, say, against these mainstream media. The term oligarchs, right? Because some media owners are indeed corporate owners. They have many other businesses. So in that sense, thriving on the grievances of that aspect, but also to discredit, and it's important to point out, critical media outlets. So outlets who have, say, reported critically on his war on drugs, on his main policies, or on his administration, his decisions. So it is these outlets who have been the target, or the most direct targets of his attacks.
Yeah, I'd like to digress a little bit, no? So kasi you mentioned yung ABS-CBN that it has reached that particular point na hindi na renew yung franchise ng network. 'Di ba? No? So can I ask you what you think is the impact of this particular move from the Duterte administration to the journalism practice and industry in the Philippines?
Okay. Definitely it has a wide-ranging impact. So that was 2020. The immediate impact that we really saw was layoffs. No, so disclosure. I mentioned earlier. Used to work for ANC, which is the ABS-CBN news channel, the cable channel of ABS-CBN. So I know, for instance, some of my former colleagues and their colleagues were laid off, because that meant a big loss of revenue for ABS-CBN, because the free channel was really their main source of income. So many journalists or many people who work in the news department and beyond in different departments of ABS-CBN were laid off. Two, in terms of press freedom, it sent what we call a major chilling effect in the media industry in the Philippines, because ABS-CBN, prior to that moment, as we know, was the giant, the largest media corporation across the board, across all media platforms in the Philippines. And it sent this message that if this could happen to ABS-CBN, which was unthinkable prior to that moment, unthinkable because it was a very powerful network, this can happen. All the more can you imagine what can happen to smaller media outlets, independent media outlets, or individual journalists. So it sent that chilling effect. And this is also a finding of my thesis. Like, the journalists themselves admitted that. Like, that is really a big warning. It raised and caused a lot of fear for the other journalists and the other media companies. But also, I have to point out, it became a rallying point, because many journalists really, despite all the threats and the odds, felt they had to stand up for this and express their views in favor of press freedom. So unfortunately, it was the pandemic, but there were still, say, protests. You could see solidarity in the media industry, say, journalists from Rappler, the Inquirer had an editorial about it. So it also, in a way, rallied and galvanized the media industry that we have to stand for ABS-CBN. We have to stand against these kinds of attacks. So I would say it's such a major event, say, in the history of Philippine media, whose effects we continue to feel. And if you remember, after that, all the typhoons, there's always this issue, and you will always hear some politicians say, some of them, those who voted, you will hear them say, oh, if only ABS-CBN would cover this. Because that was another big impact, actually. They had to, what do you call this? They had to remove, in a way, that's not the right term, but the whole regional network group, we call RNG, was taken out because of the financial impact. So say, your provincial reporters, reporters from different cities, because each city major city in the Philippines, as we know, has an ABS-CBN office, right? Their own team, their own TV patrol even. So that was all gone after the franchise. Like only individual, once in a while, reporters would stay. So up to today, we feel that impact.
Yeah, grabe no. So yung talagang source of information, yun yung isang malaking impact niya, nawala yung major source of information. No? So I'd like to circle back dun sa research mo, dun sa thesis mo, 'di ba? Kasi na-mention mo na rin yung mga conversations mo with journalists during the last 6 years, reflecting on the last 6 years of populist attacks on the media. So yun nga, as you mentioned kanina, yung offline conversation natin, we often read about it na yung mga populist regimes would attack the media, but we seldom read about how these journalists or how the industry responds. Diba? No? So maybe I'd like to ask you to share some of your findings maybe on how yung mga media personalities natin, yung mga journalists natin, felt when media was being attacked and how they responded.
Okay, so yeah, just a bit of a background. So yeah, my master study, so it's a qualitative research, which means I did in-depth interviews with journalists, 18 journalists from ABS-CBN, Rappler, and the Philippine Daily Inquirer. So 6 from each. Okay, so first your question, how did they feel? Many of them admitted, of course, they're outraged by the attacks, but also afraid because aside from the ones that we already mentioned, one main attack in the Philippines really is trolling. So trolling, in my finding, that's universal. All journalists nowadays practically experience that, and really mean, really severe kinds of rape threats, especially for female journalists, death threats. So of course I feel the impact of them. There's a mental health impact, there's a safety impact. So they obviously are against this. So there's a feeling of fear, but also outrage of wanting to respond to that attack. And they feel for their colleagues who are experiencing similar attacks, if not worse attacks. So in terms of the feeling, yeah, it's a mix of being afraid, being outraged, wanting to stand up for yourself, wanting to fight back is a common theme. We want to fight back. We want to defend press freedom. So that's the feeling. In terms of strategy and response, so I identified in my study 4 main responses. So one is reinforcing and adapting reporting practices. So in terms of reporting strategies, that has changed. Those have changed under Duterte. So I'll give you an example from my respondent. So before, Philippine media, in general, of course, not everyone, there was a tendency to be like, he said, she said, like just reporting the facts, quote unquote. Today, Duterte said this, tomorrow, Duterte said another thing. So according to my respondents, the journalists, that has changed because they realized that, with this information, with the president saying one thing and then the other, they have to call that out. So there has to be, for instance, live tweeting, right? So they have to do instant fact checking. If there's something that is not correct, they have to call that out because they feel the responsibility to their audience. So that's one. So there's a change in reporting practice. But also they feel they have to verify all the more. So part of journalism is a discipline of verification. So it comes with the job. But now that is heightened under Duterte because again, the trolls will attack you immediately or the officials will call you out. This is wrong. Even if, sometimes just an honest, innocent mistake. So all the more because of the pressure and the threat, they have to double, triple, quadruple check that the facts are correct. So there's that change in reporting, also providing more context, for example, background story, what went before, frequently asked questions. So the style of from so-called straight he said, she said, stenographic, we call it, like when you're just a stenographer. That has changed because of have to respond to this information, have to provide context. Another one is being more transparent because, as you know, the president was calling out ownership. Rappler is CIA, or Rappler is, funded by foreigners, Americans, for example, or ABS-CBN, the Lopezes, for instance. We saw Gabby Lopez testify right before Congress. So there were very specific accusations about ownership or the owners. So the journalists and the outlets felt they had to respond. So more transparency, who owns Rappler, these kinds of articles. They had media literacy workshops, trying to engage with the audience, with people. And also, I mentioned earlier, another strategy is solidarity. This is the third strategy. So, media, its competition is very fierce. Normally, we will not really, we just think within our own outlet. But with these attacks, there was a realization among the journalists that, no, we have to stand up as an industry. So you would see statements of solidarity, for instance, when the franchise issue of ABS-CBN came out, protests, they would go to ABS-CBN, or, protests for Rappler, or there would be this Black Friday press freedom protest. So solidarity is important. And lastly, advocating for press freedom. So for some journalists, they felt they had to take an activist role. So we talk about the role of journalists, right? Traditionally, some would just say, my role is to just disseminate news. That's it. I'm not an activist. That's not my job. But some felt that because press freedom is under threat, and press freedom is necessary for journalism to exist, they had to take on an activist role and really stand up and vocalize their views about what was going on, attacks on the media. They said, we have to say we are for ABS-CBN or for Rappler. Whereas before, you don't even mention that in your report. You just say, as reported in a major broadsheet. I mean, there's again competition. As reported in this news, well, you won't even mention the name. But now there's more of, again, solidarity and also being an activist for press freedom. So those are the four strategies: adapting reporting strategies, more context, more fact-checking, going beyond he said, she said. Number 2, being more transparent about ownership, about issues against them. Number 3, expressing solidarity. And then number 4, advocating for press freedom. So those are my findings.
Excellent. Looking forward to your future publications about that. No, pero I'd like to zero in dun sa fourth strategy na na-mention mo. I find that very interesting, especially in the Philippines. No, so kasi diba you mentioned that the journalist had this reflection that I have to take a more activist stance, diba? So, but I'd like to pick your brain a little bit. So, with that particular reflection, maybe you yourself have undergone that reflection, diba? No, so, how do you square that with those accusations of some people with regard to journalists being biased? How do you square that? No, so
yeah, definitely it's a tricky issue. And I would say it's like a classic debate in journalism, even before this objectivity. What is objectivity? And all the more that's heightened because of the times, the times we live in, the interesting times we live in. I would say, and also from my findings, one, we have to be clear, for instance, what we mean by activism. Because, for instance, if your stand is that, many journalists said, I see journalists, by their nature, we are for the truth, right? That's the whole nature of the job. We tell the truth. So we are naturally activists for the truth. And we are also naturally activists for press freedom, right? Because we would not be able to do our jobs without press freedom. So there's that. But yeah, it's very valid about the bias issue, because that's precisely the accusation that is being lobbied against us, being used against us, being attacked like a bias CBN or Dilawan. I would respond to that by saying, in journalism, in the book by Kovac and Rosenciel, this is my academic, objectivity is described as a process. You're objective, transparent about your process. This is what I found as a journalist. This is what I uncovered in my reporting or investigation. This is how I found it. And I think increasingly we're seeing that from many journalists, especially on social media, right? Some of them are more vocal than others in expressing their opinion, whether they are for or against Duterte or for or against a candidate. But at the very basic, say when they report about something that happened, this is what I found. This, for instance, X number of people were killed. I interviewed their relatives. This is the story of the relatives of how they were killed. I interviewed the police. The police said it was a shootout, for example, but the relatives are contesting that account. So increasingly this transparency, and I think if you stick to that, you're open about what you found out, how you found out about it, I think that is actually not just ideal, but it's necessary nowadays. Like, you have to tell your people, again, because we are bombarded by so much information that we don't know if it's true or not. You have to be very transparent what you found out, how you found out about that, and what it means. And for me, my stand personally, at least as my own journalism, is I be as transparent about this as possible, and you as a reader can see that. Like, you can form your own opinion about that, even without me having to tell you what I personally think about that. You would be able to piece that together if I am transparent about it. So yeah, it's tricky indeed, and there's like the risk of being called biased. But I think if you stick to the notion of journalism as being objective as a process, being transparent as a process, then hopefully that would help citizens make decisions, sound decisions.
Yeah, no, so kaya nga parang gusto ko lang din i-echo yung sinabi mo kanina, yung capsule definition ng journalism as a discipline of verification, di ba? No, so parang at the end of the day, it boils down to that, no? So, pero yung last two questions ko siguro medyo motherhood statements tayo, no? So, if I were,
Universe.
yeah. So if you will be, for example, faced with someone who rejoiced when the ABS-CBN franchise was not renewed, and for example, who have committed themselves to believing that traditional media is biased, how would you try to strike a conversation with that particular person? How would you convince them that no, that the media has this particular role, important role in society?
Tough one. First, I would say, it's a scenario. First, I would say I would like to listen to that person's own views and like just first hear him or her out, because I think that's also sorely lacking nowadays. We're so polarized that we just stick to our own tribes, and we already demonize people who hold a different view. But me personally, as a journalist, I think that is still fundamentally my job to ask people, what is your position on this? So yeah, first I would ask, what is your position? Why do you believe that? Where did you get your information on which you formed your conviction and your stand on this issue? So first I'd hear that. Then I would try, if it's like a convincing exercise, to try to convince. I just try to lay out the facts also as I know and as I gather them, being fully cognizant that I may not totally convince this person. because that's just how we are nowadays. And we study that also in psychology, people tend to just affirm cognitive dissonance, and you just affirm your prior information, prior beliefs. But I still try to lay out what I know are the facts, the truth, and explain. Yeah, the media is not perfect. ABS-CBN is not perfect. I think they've admitted that themselves. They've admitted, as we saw in the very long House and Senate hearings. But ABS-CBN still plays a major role in our democracy, in our society. And I think they still do a lot of good journalism. They're not perfect all the time, but they have a role there. They have a role in Philippine media. And I think it would be good for our democracy to have as many voices as possible, have as many fact checkers as possible. Yes, let's have all these bloggers, influencers, but there's also still a room for traditional journalists. So I'll try, I'll try to to have that perspective. They're always nowadays raising this whole cancel culture. Then in the same regard, why are we canceling? Why are we canceling ABS-CBN in a democracy, right? If we are a true democracy, we have voice, we have space for whether they are critical views, pro or anti, they have a role there. So I will try, but I'll be realistic about the chances of convincing this person.
All right, all right. No, so you mentioned na rin nga yung role ng media sa democracy. No? So maybe for my last question, since we are less than a month away from the elections, diba? We will have a new president by June. What do you think are the ways forward with regard to, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, repairing this relationship between the Philippine state and media outlets that the new administration will inherit from the Duterte administration?
The way forward. Well, definitely it's critical to see the next leader, the next president, the next administration's position on these media issues that we've discussed. So one critical issue definitely that will come up is the franchise still of ABS-CBN, because we do know that they were waiting for the next administration, already fully knowing that they were not successful in having the franchise renewed under the Duterte administration. I know, and we know that they're waiting for this next leader to see if they could have that approved. So that's one major issue to watch out for. The way forward, I think, now that it's still campaign period, is to try to ask these candidates, what is your stand on these media issues? What is your position on press freedom issues? Like outright, will you support, will you ask your congressional allies, because it's a congressional issue, will you ask your congressional allies to renew the franchise of ABS-CBN or not? So I think that's one of the election issues that we can pose to candidates. And I would say even just their behavior now as candidates or as politicians and their track record, you can see some of these clues there. Like, are they open? Are they transparent? Do they attend debates? Do they respond to journalists' questions? Or do they only speak to journalists who are friendly to them, for example? Are they easily offended? Do they attack journalists who ask controversial questions? So we can see that. But the next 6 years, definitely the franchise renewal of ABS-CBN is one. And also the cases. There's still many pending cases against many journalists, not just say journalists from Rappler. Journalists are imprisoned under this administration. We were talking earlier about cyber libel, for instance. That's one major issue. Are they gonna repeal this law? Do they believe that cyber libel should exist, and for what specific, say, conditions or cases, circumstances should just it be, or should any critical story be the subject of a cyber libel case? That's one. And even if you want to go, the criminalization of libel. So in the Philippines is one of the few remaining countries in the world where libel is a criminal offense, meaning you can get jailed for libel. The trend in other countries is to decriminalize libel, but we have journalists who are imprisoned or who face imprisonment for libel. So these are very important issues. And if there's anything the last 6 years has shown us in terms of media, is that these are important issues to talk about. These are important issues to raise to candidates. And we can ask them, but we can also ask the voters, observe already and assess how have they been conducting themselves in relation to these issues. Do they sue people who are critical against them? Are these valid cases? So things like that, I think, is very important. I know we have many issues to consider in the elections, not least the pandemic, but definitely this is one. And I think it's an indicator. If you want a candidate or a president who supports democracy or who will protect democracy or, recover or improve Philippine democracy, then the media is one important pillar of democracy.
All right. So I completely agree with what you said, that this is definitely a major election issue that we need to talk about. That's why we're also having this conversation and the episode to come out before the people decides on the next administration. So I think with that, we can end this conversation. Thank you, Ai, for agreeing to share your insights in this episode of podcast. Would you like to invite our listeners to any activities that you may have, any publication coming up, or Twitter handler where they can follow you?
Yeah, I guess just the Twitter. So I'm at Ai Makaraig, tweeting about everything about the world, particularly interested in politics. Publication, we will find out. I still need to wait for word about my thesis if it will be published. But thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity and a very important topic to discuss.
We would like to thank Ai for generously lending us her expertise and guesting in this episode of Hindi na Bago Yan. Watch out for a new episode every Saturday. For updates on the show, like, subscribe, or follow our social media pages. That's it for now. Have a good day.